Shall we move to consider what happens when in Freshmanistan, in the world of internal mediation, things can escalate. We're thinking of rivalries that grow in scale, and this is formalized in ritual contest, but it happens when things get tribal as well. People get together in groups, and there will be conflicts or rivalries, competitions that can build to the point they get out of control. And Girard looked at this in a lot of contexts. He looked at it through history. He looked at it, he became an anthropologist. He looked at conflicts within early societies and the way that these conflicts these rivalries could build to the point where it became a threatening problem. We're talking about mimetic violence now, build to the point where it was a danger to the very existence of the community, to the group, to a nation, and we could even consider international politics today, where there are certain rivalries. We've seen this in some of the hotspots around the world. Girard emphasized and wrote books about the mechanism of scapegoating, he called it, and looked at how conflict resolves still through mimetic processes to restore a kind of peace. But that's a problematic restoration in itself. Would you like to talk about scapegoating and tell us what mimetic theory brings to that idea of scapegoating?
Sure. Well, let me just connect this to where we were talking before about these two worlds, Celebristan and Freshmanistan. There's something happens in Freshmanistan that doesn't happen in Celebristan. Something happens in the world of internal mediators of desire, and that is reciprocal mimesis or reciprocal imitation. In Celebristan, Michael Jordan is not going to start imitating me back. The imitation goes one way. In Freshmanistan, where somebody's my colleague, a friend, a business rival, something like that, we can begin imitating one another in this rivalry. And this is where the internal mediation can become dangerous, because it's contagious and it escalates, because we're both now parties to a game of mimesis, which really has no end. Like, where does it stop? When will one ever acquire something that completely satisfies? Well, it will never happen. And in a community, a town, in a team, in an organization, in any sort of closed system, where there are a bunch of relationships of internal mediation, where everybody is in some sense an internal mediator of desire, potentially to everybody else in the group, then the mimesis, the negative mimesis, the rivalry, the tension and conflict can spread by contagion. So something that sort of can start with just a couple of people can spread to the whole group. Girard, you might know this quote, I'll get it wrong, says something to the effect, he's speaking about globalization, and he said, at a certain point, you'll be able to light a single match that will set the whole world on fire. He's referring to a world in which these internal mediators or internal rivalries can spread to more and more people very quickly, and technology can accelerate that through social media. And what happens then? How do we put the brakes on this? How do we resolve this situation, put an end to it? As you said, it's been the scapegoat mechanism. This is a huge part of mimetic theory. And chapter 4 in my book is dedicated to it. I could have written a whole book on just the scapegoat mechanism. It's daunting to think about having to do that. So what happens? Societies have always sort of resorted to the scapegoat mechanism, and you said it, Matthew. It happens through a mimetic process. So there's this great irony that the solution to the mimetic escalation is a mimetic process that results in a single person or a single group singled out and accused for the cause of all the problems, and people unite around this victim, and they unite through a mimetic process, right? So the ancient practice of stoning worked because it was a highly mimetic act. Once one person threw the first stone, the second stone was a lot easier to throw, and the third, the fourth, and the fifth exponentially easier to throw. And I think this is probably part of the rationale behind the old biblical prescriptions, that you needed more than one accuser, right? Or you needed two people who were both witnesses to sort of throw at the same time or something, because there's a mimetic process that is kicked off very easily through an accusation or through fear. And we see how that has resulted in the unification of groups. Tragically, I mean, it actually has brought a sense of catharsis and healing to the groups that participate in this type of scapegoating ritual. And there's always a ritual behind it, because the ritual is part of what brings the catharsis. You think about the ancient ritual on Yom Kippur, where there was this highly ritualized symbolic transferring of the sins of the people onto a goat, and the goat was collectively driven out into the wilderness by the people. And the fact that the people collectively did this together is a very important part of the process, right? If it was just the high priest that transferred the sins onto the goat and then secretly went out behind the temple and drove the goat out into the wilderness, it wouldn't have the same effect on the community, because they have to be involved in this collective process of expiating their own sins, so to speak, which as we know, is not actually possible to do. So there's always a need of a new scapegoat and a bigger and better scapegoat.
And Luke, today we see that pattern, or that tendency in so many different places in popular culture. We think about the dynamic of the crowd. We think of mob mentality or the mind of the herd, and cancel culture is another example of this today. Would you like to say a little bit more about some of these situations? I mean, how do we contend with that? It's a very powerful dynamic, because, like you say, everyone joins in, right? And there are mimetic pressures. I mean, if we think of high school or college, we think about peer pressure. There's another term for what we're talking about here. How does mimetic theory help us understand these incredibly quick patterns that occur in popular culture all the time?
Well, there's dangerous power in anonymity. Even just think about what it's like to live in a big city. I've lived in New York City before. It's a very different experience than living in a small town where everybody knows everybody else. In some sense, you almost feel anonymous. And people can engage in behaviors that they might not engage in if they lived in a small town, right? They walk into the sex shop, or they do something, like nobody knows who they are. So there's a sense of anonymity, and I think that's important. You look at the internet now, and first of all, there are many pseudo-anonymous people and profiles out there, but you have a sense of anonymity on the internet, or at least, not if it's not anonymity, a sense that you're sort of safe behind the privacy of your own screen, and you sort of, there's not a lot of consequences for your behavior. At worst, you might get banned or something like that. And now, you can lose your job because people are, as part of a background check, people are checking social media profiles. But I think that it's really easier to join in sort of mob behavior in this kind of environment. And part of the reason that the scapegoat mechanism works, part of the reason why it worked even in the ancient cultures, is that there was a sense that no single person was responsible. In the ancient ritual of the one of the ways that in Greece the scapegoat was called the pharmakos, and this a Greek word that means the poison and the cure at the same time. It's the origin of our word pharmacy today. And one of the ways that the pharmakos was made a scapegoat is the people would collectively drive this person off of the edge of a cliff, They would quite literally put the person on the edge of a cliff and crowd around the person and keep crowding until they were backed off the cliff. There's a movie that came out just a couple of years ago called Midsummer, terrifying horror film, where this exact thing happens in the movie. I'd be surprised if the director or the writer hadn't read Girard. So why is that effective? Well, not a single one person actually pushed the person off of the cliff. The whole crowd was responsible for the person getting pushed off the cliff. So, the blame can't be assigned. Nobody has to actually think of themselves as having single-handedly executed the person. And I think with some of the online culture, with cancel culture, there's this element of anonymity that's very important. So how do we stop that? I mean, I think one way would just be to not make it so easy to join in. There have to be some consequences and some accountability for that. We've got to have a way to put the brakes on it and not just add fuel to the fire. So, of course, I don't have a solution. I don't have an answer. But I think there's going to have to be some countermeasure, some counterforce that holds the people that join in accountable. It has to be harder to sort of join in some of this behavior when people's livelihoods and reputations are at stake. And there has to be a way for the truth to eventually come out, because part of the scapegoat mechanism is a distortion of the truth, where the scapegoat is perceived as guilty, and through the mimetic process that we're describing, the mimesis actually distorts reality and distorts the truth. Truth is hidden in some sense. And this is a big part of Girard. This is where mythologies develop. Stories are told, and the stories are always told from the standpoint of the scapegoaters, never the scapegoat, with the exception of with the apostles. We'll get to that later. So it's the stories are always told with the people committing the violence, absolving themselves of blame, and shaping the narrative in such a way where it makes them come out looking squeaky clean.
That's a great place for us to perhaps turn to consider counter narratives or perspectives on the scapegoating experience, or perspectives from the people being scapegoated. And through the 20th century, this, some of the horrors have reminded us of, we know more than ever what scapegoating is now. We think about cancel culture and some of the crimes of the 20th century. There's a greater awareness about people being victimized, about groups being marginalized, and so on. And we have the story in earlier observations of this, and in scripture, about a different way, or at least a clearer understanding of what's going on in the scapegoating process. So today, we talk about scapegoating in all sorts of ways today. Perhaps we could turn to the second part of the book and think about some of the spiritual questions that you explore in Wanting. And maybe one place to start might be to come around to some of the tactics that you suggest in the book. And one of the first ones there suggests that we name our models. And it's a very simple, perhaps counterintuitive thing to do. And you have a whole series of tactics through the book, which are thought-provoking. And I think often because of the problematic kinds of imitation that we get caught up in, being explicit about models can be a difficult thing to do. Or sometimes because of internal mediation, we like to hide or avoid acknowledging who models might be. Bad influences. There's another name for a model, an influence.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So do you want to say something about those tactics and the approach that you've taken in being quite explicit with some of these suggestions? Name your models, for example.
Yeah. Well, there's 15 of them in the book, and there are things that I've experienced and actually put into practice in my life. I say at one point in the book, mimetic desire is not something to be escaped or transcended. I don't believe that's possible. But we can live with a greater awareness of this so that we don't participate in the negative forms of mimetic rivalry and of scapegoating and these things. And this involves, part of it's a spiritual practice, frankly. You alluded to the idea that we should have a greater awareness of scapegoats than ever. As stories have emerged from marginalized voices in the 20th century and earlier. And we've heard these voices sometimes for the very first time. And there seems to be a level of consciousness of this. So you would think then, well, we just probably aren't making any scapegoats anymore. We seem to be continuing to make them, even while, we have a greater awareness of the atrocities of the past. So this is just quite simply a case of seeing the scapegoating everywhere, but in ourselves. Not seeing our own sin, to put it in Christian terms, to see everybody else's mimesis, to see everybody else's tendency to make scapegoats. So this has to do with for me, a spiritual practice, and naming my models it's kind of like naming emotions, a very important thing to do. It's like naming my sins, naming these influences, positive and negative, both, I think are a really important thing to do. And this is just the first tactic in the book. And I would add, this is a very important part of that process, that it's not something that I think anybody can do alone. I think this is something that does require good friends, mentors, if you're spiritual, a pastor or something like that, people where you can enter into just radical, honest dialogue with. My wife is much better understanding of who my models are often than I do, and make sure to point them out to me sometimes, right? Or I've written a book about this stuff, and this is why it's tricky. The intellectual knowledge of that this exists is different in a sense than the ability, which is kind of in the will to overcome some pride and ego, and to be able to look at ourselves and the forces that are driving us. So many people, including you, Matthew, I think have read at least the second part of the book, and been like, wow, this seems almost spiritual in nature. And it's because I think that it is. It's certainly what the journey was like for me.
Luke, thank you so much.
Thank you, Matthew, for the conversations.
Blessings to you. Thank you, Luke.
You too.
Cheers.